see so many folks here on a Saturday in summer. So let me talk about, I'm going to try not to talk too long because I think questions are helpful, but talk about the process and how we are where we are. You will remember that in 2018 the mayor submitted to the council a revisions to the framework element. The framework element is the introductory chapter to the comprehensive plan. The plan was adopted in around 2005 as a 20-year plan with the expectation that there would be amendments every 5 years. So the council adopted some amendments in 2011. This is the second amendment cycle, and I know that the math doesn't add, but that's what this is, the second amendment cycle. What we are expecting is that this fall, I would expect at the end of this fall, we will receive from the Office of Planning proposed amendments to the rest of the comprehensive plan. That would be the other chapters or elements. So what we acted on was the framework element only. We had a hearing in March of 2018. I was reminded that it was about a 13-hour hearing. There was extensive testimony, and I would say most of it was critical of the plan one way or the other, critical of the framework element. To my way of thinking, and I've said this publicly before, and I've said this to you all when I've been here before, I think the greatest deficiencies that were in the framework element submitted by the mayor were that, first, it omitted almost any reference to housing and affordable housing being an important priority. And when the plan was adopted in 2005, the city wasn't thinking about an affordability crisis. The city was thinking about how, decade after decade, our population had dropped, about how we wanted to increase the population of the city. We wanted to see more jobs. We wanted to see more economic opportunity. We wanted to see that where there was economic development, like commercial development, it wasn't all happening on the west side of the city, but rather was spread around the city. That's what the city was thinking in 2005 when the plan was adopted. The framework element that was submitted by the mayor said virtually nothing about housing or affordable housing. And then the other major complaint that I heard, and now there were a variety of complaints, but the other one that I think considered very important was that the mayor in her proposal was trying to deal with the issue of planned unit developments and the fact that the PUDs were getting, a lot of them were getting hung up with legal action. And so she wanted to, in a sense, or in effect, amend the land use element by adjusting or revising the definitions of various categories, land use categories in the framework, and basically saying that these categories are not just general, but they're really very general. And in fact, if anybody thinks that the zoning commission didn't get it right, the mayor's proposal had language in it that would say that however the zoning commission interpreted it was what would be the actual meaning and intent of the comprehensive plan. I say that with a little bit of a difficulty to have a completely serious face about it, because I thought it just went too far in taking the plan and making it less of a plan. Since the March 2018 hearing, there's been a fair amount of pressure on me and the council to move forward with the framework. And I've actually indicated for quite some time. First, I wanted the framework to get out of the council last fall. That didn't happen. And that then I wanted to get out of the council before we went on summer recess. Well, what we did on Tuesday was to approve a revision to the framework on first reading, and second reading will be probably September 17th when the council meets next. So really the public has an unusual opportunity in over 2 months to look at the draft as it stands right now, having gone through first reading, to make additional comments if desired before we vote on second reading. I think I've addressed the issue here of timing, because I know there was some concern the council should slow down. Actually, what I hear from a lot of folks is the council should move more quickly, because we have had the plan, the framework, for so long. And as I said, we've taken the way that this is working is that there will now be 2 months between first and second readings. I'm trying to think if there were a couple other things I wanted to cover before I take questions. As Parissa noted, there was language added with regard to the issue of equity and looking at equity, and I'm not sure we've gotten it right yet, but there was language added regarding that. As I recall, very little testimony about that a year and a half ago, or March of 2018, and certainly nothing from the Office of Planning until very recently. So some language has been added about that. And there was some discussion on Tuesday about the issue of when a developer gets bonuses, how much of the increased value has to be turned back into amenities. We had some adjustments to the language that the Office of Planning had. They actually, it would have been in the draft that was circulated a week before the vote. We actually toned that back a little bit on the advice of attorneys. I'm still willing to look at that issue and see if we can adjust it, because I believe that when we give bonus densities, that there ought to be something commensurate in return. And it's really, I think, evaluating the legal issue and seeing how far we can go with that in the document. With that, let me open up to questions, although I do want to introduce Julia Costa, who's got her hand up in the back. She has detailed to my office from the National Capital Planning Commission and has done the yeoman's work on this draft. Are there questions?
Okay. Just 1 second before we open the audience, we had a couple things we wanted to just ask a little bit more in depth. You just talked about the land value recapture. Can you just talk a little bit more about what are the legal issues, what types of legal issues, and what type of information you need in order to move that forward?
The legal issues, as explained to me, are that if we are too rigid in the legal language with regard to recapturing all of the value, increased value, that it would raise a takings argument on the theory that zoning is permitted as a police power for public health. I would say primarily public health, and if zoning is written too strictly as a matter of value rather than regulating public health, that then there could be a takings argument. I'm not explaining that very well, and I've not read the case law regarding it. As I indicated, my sympathy is that if we're going to take a residential project, let's say, that is permitted matter of right at 6 stories and add a story, we ought to get a story of affordable housing that is equal to the additional value we've created. That's my bias, and I will certainly push with the attorneys on that issue.
Okay, and I think part of what we were proposing is that it not just be related to bonus density in zoning, but any kind of subsidy. So the public land, some kind of TIF, some kind of other types of incentives. And I think Robert White's bill, the return on investment legislation that was passed by the council last year, kind of speaks to that, except for that it's very much after the fact, saying let's have a report on what we got from these subsidies. And I think what we're hoping to achieve is language on the front end saying if we're going to get these subsidies, we expect an equal amount of public benefit.
Well, let me remind you of a couple of things that happen. There are other dynamics that get involved here, and we're, I think, talking outside of the comprehensive plan. A few years ago, when the Deputy Mayor for Planning and Economic Development was under the Committee of the Whole, I had jurisdiction. One of the first dispositions that came before the council was for 965 Florida Avenue. Some of you may remember that. And my recollection now is a little rough in terms of the numbers, but I remember that there was an appraisal that the DEMPEC gave us that without the affordable housing component, that is, at highest and best use, the property was valued about $28 million. But we were selling it to the developer, as I recall, for something closer to, I'm going to say $400,000. We did an appraisal, and as a result of the appraisal we did, I better understood the affordable housing took down the value because of the amount of affordable housing required. Took down the value of the land to, if I remember correctly, about $4 million. And the reason for that was that the developer puts into their pro forma what is not only just the cost of building the housing, but to operate the building with the rental income that comes in. And if you have affordable housing, you have less rental income, so that affects the pro forma, and the amount by which it affects it reduces the value of the land. And there were a couple of things that came out of that, but one of which is relevant to this conversation is that I tried to, and my numbers are a little bit off, but you could easily look this up. In fact, the committee report on 965 Florida is available on the council's website. I tried to slow this down and, in fact, to put pressure on DEMPED to renegotiate a better disposition terms for the city. But there was a substantial affordable housing component, and there were a number of council members and housing advocates who pushed back really hard, saying, how dare the council hold this up? This is about affordable housing. We want the affordable housing. So that political dynamic comes into play on dispositions. Now, you mentioned TIFs, tax income and financing. There's a dynamic there, and it's similar. And with the dynamic there is that we have a requirement in the law that before the council acts on a TIF, we get what's called a TAF, or a tax abatement financial analysis. That's true for tax abatements as well as TIFs. And the CFO looks at the project, looks at what the expected revenue will be and the costs and so forth, and then gives us an opinion. It's a written document. Gives us opinion on whether the tax abatement or TIF is actually necessary. But for the TIF, this project would not happen. And what the council has generally done is approve the TIFs and the abatements regardless of what the conclusion of the TAF is. With this council period, I proposed, the council adopted a change in the rules so that if there is a negative TAFA, meaning the abatement or TIF isn't necessary, and on first reading it requires, I think it's a 2/3 vote of the council. But generally these votes are overwhelmingly in support of moving forward. So there's that dynamic as well.
Okay. So I guess the follow-up question then is just what will the process be? Because, of course, at the hearing, you and Councilwoman Silverman talked about, okay, we're going to be looking at this over the summer. So what does that look like?
Talking about the land value recapture?
Yes, yeah. And what is the opportunity for public input?
Well, we continue to get comments. I mean, I'm hearing comments today, and I expect that we'll be getting some written comments from various groups over the course of the summer. The record's closed, which only means we don't have to file the comments, but that doesn't mean we won't look at them. I'm trying to meet with council members next week, those council members who expressed concerns about these issues, to see where we can refine the language to have it more satisfactory. Let me just say that on a lot of these issues there are competing views, and so we're trying to do a balancing there. And also let me say that this is even though we're giving a lot of attention to the plan and the framework is more general than the rest of the plan, but it's still a general document. And sometimes folks want us to get right down into the granular prescription, and the plan is probably not the place for that. And I say that because in my conversations with members, and also looking at comments that we get from groups, we generally try to find, Julia takes the lead on this, but Julia talks with me, and we try to find what is fairly, I'm going to say fairly simplified language, and where it fits best in the document. And so I hope that helps with explaining the process.
Yeah, and I think we should be just sending your office as much information as we can come up with and suggestions, and look to maybe communicate again after that meeting with the other council members next week. I'm going to ask you a couple more questions before we open it up. You referenced the racial equity language and said it may not be right. I was wondering, why didn't racial equity get added as a guiding principle, which was one of the proposals? And also, what are the ways, just with your experience, what are the ways that you think the comp plan can drive racial equity most effectively? is it language in the framework? Is it a guiding principle? Is it very specific language in chapters? How can we use this tool to its most effect to push for racial equity?
It wasn't added to the principles because we instead added it as a cross-cutting theme early in the framework. So somebody may say it's best here, and we may have ended up putting it there, but it's still in there, and it's in there as a cross-cutting principle as opposed to, there's some other places where it could have been put where it would have had very little value. We also, we received comments from the Office of Planning, as you noted, as I was coming in. Councilmember McDuffie wrote something that was fairly extensive, and Councilmember White gave us some comments. Councilmember White's comments kind of got, we got a little crossways with all the last-minute stuff that was happening. So he's one of the council members that I'm meeting with to go over his comments. But I will say that what the framework will end up saying with regard to racial equity or any kind of equity is not going to be a long, extensive discussion. Very little of the framework is a long, extensive discussion on any issue. With regard to how to best affect it, it comes into play in a number of ways, but the detail is going to be in the land use element and in the housing element. And that's where there should be more detail about this. Given that the plan, now to some extent I'm just revealing my own bias, the plan has got maybe a dozen or more elements to it or chapters. It's good as a statement of what the government's desire is, but with regard to implementation, really most of the attention is given to the land use element.
Land use element. What are you expecting to happen over the break? Are you expecting, you mentioned the meeting with the council people next week. Will there be any other sort of milestones that we should be aware of in terms of how this will get shaped? You talked about attorneys, so I guess you'll be running things by, general counsel?
General counsel and others.
Okay.
I'm meeting with council members individually, most of them, the ones whom I'm meeting with, it's only 3 or 4 next week. So it's not like one group meeting. And I expect that there will continue to be some meetings over the course of the next 2 months. Milestone, I'm not sure that there are any milestones before September 17th. The report has to be filed, and once the report is filed, the bill is engrossed. That's a term that the council has. That's the version that reflects all the amendments that were made, which wasn't very many, on first reading. So that document, I hope, will be available online by the end of the month.
And the version that will be voted on September 17th is that version with any amendments will happen at the meeting? There won't
Correct.
be any changes? Okay.
Well, I may circulate what we call an amendment nature of a substitute the day before, but that will be, I don't know that it would have anything substantial in it. It might. But because this is a long document, about 60 pages long, and it's really more prose than it is legalese. And so as we read a paragraph and we see that we'd rather say the than and, we'll change that, and rather than do an amendment sheet, that will be factored into an amendment nature of a substitute. So that will be circulated the day before. Our rules require it by noon the day before.
Okay. One suggestion that we had was a hearing just on the data that the Office of Planning is using to underpin its projections of population, et cetera. For us, we read it as very supply side, like saying, because there's this many housing units in the pipeline to be built, then therefore there will be this many people coming to the city. But it doesn't, for us, it lacks a lot of analysis. It also fails to mention key things like the recent report sharing that DC is the most rapidly gentrifying city in the country, and that we have a form of displacement that's unseen in other places. Key reports that have come out, key data that have come out that are not referenced in the document. And so we wondered if you would consider holding a hearing just on that data, since that seems to be so central to everything else. It's like, we're going to have this number of people because we're going to build this much housing, failing to really analyze who are we building for.
Well, I'm not sure I agree that the data is a little bit old. It's, I think, 2015, 2016. Yeah, that's a little bit old. But I'm not sure that I read the data as the way that you're reading it. As I recall, the data supports that we have a population growing faster than our housing inventory, and that we're losing lower income folks quickly because we're not able to maintain a level of affordable housing. That's how I read the data, not the other way around.
But, it does mention foreign investment very briefly. It doesn't talk about the extent of it and how it's driving the housing market. It doesn't talk about the vacancy rates and how much is investor-owned housing. Yep. So I think, some of those things seem to be important. The mayor's intent is to use this document to make the case for 36,000 new units of housing and to allow more density in certain neighborhoods for that. But it's not clear who we're building for. And, we don't want investor-owned housing to be one of the things that...
Well, but who we're building for is we're trying to build a mix, but we're trying to build housing for lower income families, lower income households, and for families, not just simply single and one-bedroom apartments. I think that's in there now. I've got to say that when we had the hearing a year ago, I remember very little criticism of the data, but I would also say that I think that to the extent that you want to challenge the data, there will be the opportunity to do that when we get the other elements.
Okay. Yeah, all right. And then one other question was, we know we have that for September hearing, and Office of Planning, I think, is saying that they're going to...
September meeting.
The September 17th...
You said hearing, it's a meeting.
Meeting, okay, where the vote will happen.
Yes.
Office of Planning is saying that they will release their chapters end of October for a 60-day, we're in October for a 60-day review. We had suggested that, it would not make sense to have a hearing on 900 pages, that we should allocate certain chapters to different committees, have a hearing on the housing chapter in the housing committee, economic development, et cetera, so that there's a more manageable piece for us to all engage in. You said when we raised that last time, remind me of that later when we get there. So I wanted to remind you of that and see how it strikes you now in terms of that process.
Well, I think probably the referral will include comments from the different committees, but I'm not sure that hearings by the other committees as a requirement is a good way to go. The document is going to come through the committee of the whole. It's not like the budget. It's not going to be that the housing committee does the housing element and then the committee of the whole just simply puts it all together. The committees, if they want to, can have hearings, if they have comments, and I think they will. I think the better course, though, is that the committee of the whole look to breaking up the hearings so that, for one thing, we don't have a 13-hour hearing, but for another, that maybe we do the hearings by issue. Now, don't take from that if there are 30 issues, there'll be 30 hearings, but maybe we have a hearing that's focusing on housing and look at a few major issues like that. Have the committee of the whole would have hearings focused on that, as well as ensuring that we don't have a long marathon hearing. I will add this as well. The Office of Planning, I'm not sure when they're going to get the document. I do think that the Office of Planning under Andrew Trueblood is going to be better about the public comment process than we saw before. Now, I know there was a lot of complaint that OP promised, 60 days before it came to the council, and that didn't happen. On the other hand, there's been, I want to say 560 days since the document came to the council and our first vote. If we get the bill at the end of this year, there's a good chance, this is not a promise or a commitment, but there's a good chance that we would have a hearing or a couple of hearings or maybe a series of hearings before we get the budget. That means before February, but that we would not actually act on voting something until after the budget. So there'll be time. I'm not...
So you are, it sounds like you are committing, however, that you will not have one hearing on 900 pages for the remaining.
Well, if I get 3 witnesses, I'll have one hearing.
Well, you're not going to get 3.
Okay.
Okay, my last question,
Okay.
and then I wanted to suggest if people have questions to come here to the mic, if you don't mind, and also makes it easier for me than to have to call names, if you don't mind lining up. But my last question is about public housing. You know, the Housing Authority has now announced that 2,600 families will be displaced, at least temporarily. Many of those buildings will be demolished, if not, a few of them will be rehabbed. My question to you is, in relationship to the comprehensive plan, should we be looking to have very specific, tangible language in there, either in the area elements where these properties exist or in the housing chapter, that guides what can and should happen to prevent displacement, to ensure that we rebuild these places, et cetera?
Let me see. I don't think the housing element is a place for more specificity than the framework. The housing element is a place to look in more detail about our housing policy. But I don't think the housing element should be the place where we legislate requirements with regard to public housing. That should be in separate freestanding legislation that is in whatever chapter of the code regulates public housing.
Freestanding legislation?
Yes, that's what I would say.
Can we get your commitment to work with us on freestanding legislation to
Sure.
secure public housing?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. So I'm just going to let you all govern yourselves, because Aziza really wants me to go color with her.
Let's say that the framework element is particularly important because it specifies our recourse to courts and the enforcement of objections as they arise. And and Empower thought that we had a friend in you of all the council members, that you understood that we didn't want to have descriptions rather than definitions, and that we wanted to be able to appeal substantive matters to court and have the court have something to listen to and have a hook. And it seems as though in your version that you have introduced now, you have gone to the dark side and agreed to the squishy language, and so that it would be very difficult. Anybody can file a court suit, but if the court has nothing to look it onto, they won't hear it. Do you follow me?
I sort of do. I don't think the...
I remember what phrase in particular was that the Office of Planning suggested that there be a clarification of authority in the zoning commission where they would have discretion, and that the discretion could not be challenged.
Okay. So I've heard a couple of things from you. With regard to that latter point, I thought I addressed that earlier. There was language in what the mayor submitted that gave extreme deference to the zoning commission.
Yes.
We took that language out.
Well, that's good news.
Now, I also heard...
When I saw your version, I didn't feel as though it was all that strong. Why are the terms generally soft-edged and interpreted broadly still in the framework?
Okay, now I'm kind of getting a little confused because generally soft edge, you don't need to give that to me. The generally soft edge would be the squishy that you just said you want.
No, we do not want squishy language. No.
Okay, I thought you didn't want definitions.
We want definitions rather than descriptions.
Okay, well, we've
We
got
want something that we can appeal if they make a mistake.
Wow.
Okay. Well, I think you should be able to appeal if they make a mistake, but...
Well, if they had total discretion, what would the mistake be?
Okay, I'm getting lost here. The plan should not be the zone map. It's a plan. So the plan should say low, medium, low, moderate, medium. It shouldn't say R1A or, they've changed the zone categories, so I don't remember all of them now, but it shouldn't say R1A and C5. It should say low, moderate, medium, high density. Now, that may not be specific enough in your view, but I don't. But what I'm saying is that it's a plan. It's not meant to be more precise.
The language originally said not strictly to be followed. Do you remember that phrase? And we all objected to that. And I thought you were on our side. Has that been corrected?
That was correct. That was corrected, but the other stuff was left in. Interpreted broadly.
All right, Chris is saying that was corrected, but the other stuff was left in.
Yeah. Like you added soft edge. You didn't understand that. But maybe yes.
Hi, Phil. Thank you for being here.
Sure.
I have two questions. The first one, you made dozens of decisions, if not hundreds of decisions, in redrafting the framework element amendments. And I'm wondering if you had a sort of uniform approach or philosophy to how you made those decisions, whether they were inclusions, removals, changes in language. Question number two is...
Why don't I stick with question one, and then we can go to two, if that's okay.
All right.
I read well, Julia took the bill as introduced, the current document that is what was adopted and revised 5 years ago, 7 years ago, and the comments that we received, and she put together a draft, which I read cover to cover, maybe first page to last page, and in reading it, a lot of the changes you would have seen if you look closely were at readability or whether it made sense. But then when we get into the more difficult areas, it was trying to find the balance between having some flexibility and not too much. And that's a subjective balance call, balancing. I've been involved one way or another with the comprehensive plan for 30 years, and so I bring to my reading of it issues that have been debated, have been litigated over the last 30 years, and tried to come up with a document, a draft, a bill, a committee print to vote on that I think strikes a pretty good balance. I'm not saying it's perfect yet, but a pretty good balance between guidance, that's a plan, and not rigidity, and not so vague that it has no meaning and actually can be used against people. So I don't know if that helps you, but that was your question. What was my thought process?
My second question.
Okay.
As you know, during the marathon hearing, the overwhelming number of witnesses asked not only that the Office of Planning language be excised, but also that there be controls, if you will, put on the Zoning Commission, because there was a perception among many people who've dealt with the Zoning Commission that they operate very much as an arm of the Mayor's Economic Development Program. So when we look at what the framework element definitions are that were passed by the Council, I want to give you some examples, because it appears that the predictability and a lot of the squishy language that we were looking to be removed has not entirely been removed. And in fact, in some cases, new squishy language was added. In the general policy map, for example, under neighborhood conservation areas, you've added generally and typically to the to the definition and the description. In enhancement areas, you added and comprehensive plan policies to the requirement that new development has to be consistent with the FLUM, the future land use map. For many of us, adding that phrase and comprehensive policies means anything goes, because as you know, the Office of Planning cherry picks the thousands of policies in the comprehensive plan, and what many residents have been relying on is that the FLUM is actually prescriptive and that the zoning commission has to follow it, which is exactly what the Office of Planning was trying to upend. They wanted the FLUM to no longer carry any influence. So adding that language seems to be not going as far as the Office of Planning, but being somewhat consistent with their goals. Under the land use change areas, with regard to new development, you removed not negatively impact nearby neighborhoods and replaced it with should avoid negative impacts, which I interpret as much less directive, more squishy. For the central employment area, there were no changes despite the huge expansion in that area and the Zoning Commission's historical avoidance of requiring affordable housing. Then when you get to the FLUM, you maintained the existing language, other zones may apply, which doesn't go as far as what the Office of Planning wanted, but continues to give the Zoning Commission enormous flexibility in how they are zoning the city and how they are approving map amendments. In particular, you look at the medium density commercial classification, which the Zoning Commission has put the majority of commercial zones into that classification. There are zones in that classification that currently have maximum heights of 40 feet. The definition that the council approved for medium density commercial would go up to 90 feet. It seems to me that that is going to disincentivize a developer from going to the Zoning Commission to get a PUD, which would include some of your new very good requirements regarding displacement and additional affordable housing, because they can get matter of right approval. Go to the Zoning Commission, just get a map amendment where, you know, this huge range of zones is in medium density. So all they have to say is, well, we're at the bottom of this range right now, we want to go to the top. So my question is, or my comment is that for some of us, it appears that the framework element, particularly with regard to the definitions, is enabling the Zoning Commission to continue to do what they're doing unchecked.
Well, I don't agree with your interpretation now, and there's a lot of specificity in there, and I'm not going to be able to hang on to all of it. But the fact that there might be a zone that allows 90 feet that's within the definition of, let's say, moderate, doesn't mean that that would be a correct reading. And in fact, the way we clearly intended was that we have for moderate density, we have I'm going to say a guideline with regard to feet or stories. I think for residential it's stories, and for commercial it's feet. And we have a guideline. But there are some zones that apply to, and we say this specifically, there's some zones that apply to different categories, and that's because of the nature of the zone. Because remember, zoning is a combination of FAR and setbacks and height. And so it's possible that there's a zone that permits a higher height than what the density would be that we ascribe to moderate as opposed to medium as opposed to high. So I just don't agree that one could, yes, I think a developer could make an argument, but not a persuasive argument, that, well, the zone allows 90 feet and therefore you can have 90 feet in a moderate density zone. I think we've written against that. Now, happy to look at that some more. That's the reason why I'm here and Julia is here. We actually struggled quite a bit with the fact that there are some zones that are specified, but it's clear that those zones don't always correlate to that land use category.
I think what you would find historically is that the zoning commission, their tactic is they describe a particular zone as moderate to medium or medium to high. They leave it there for a couple of years. Somebody comes in with a development project and says, well, this is really medium, or this is should really be high. The zoning commission invariably goes along with that. So that's how we get increased density. And I think one of the things the council needs to consider is that if you are very serious about implementing the displacement requirements and implementing higher affordable housing requirements, you're doing that through PUDs. And if you make the matter of right heights so high that a developer has no incentive, in fact has disincentives, to go to the zoning commission to seek a PUD, is the public losing out?
Okay, but what's going through my mind is I'm just thinking we worked off of a lot of comments we got. We worked off of the current element, the framework, and we worked off of what the Office of Planning had submitted. We actually, as I recall, they had for commercial, moderate, and medium were both at 50 feet. We said you can't do that. You can't have moderate and medium at the same height.
You kept that actually, about 40 and 50.
Yeah, it's 40 and 50. We changed it. But
And then it jumps to 90.
But we're also struggling with that with the PUD, particularly on a larger tract, you're going to want to have some flexibility. And you might want to have a greater height at one portion of the site in return for lower density and lower heights, maybe even just open space at another portion of the site.
The framework element doesn't say.
I'm afraid it does. It actually does.
You did in response to it does say that.
So
can we look forward to seeing something more specific in the land use element?
well, I don't know what that means, because the devil is here, and I'm just being honest with you, the devil's in the details. I think that what we voted on last Tuesday has the right balance between being specific and general. And that clearly you don't, and others may not. I'm certainly willing to look at it some more. It might mean a longer conversation with you. But I'm going to add something else as well. There's a lot of pressure from other folks about how we need to increase densities, increase heights, that in order to accommodate affordable housing. There's a lot of pressure on that side. So the biggest concern I had going into Tuesday was that there was going to be an amendment that was going to eliminate single-family housing in the city. And it was going to require that all residential lots have at least 2 or more units. I know as well that there is talk, continuing low rumbles about getting rid of the height limit in order to allow greater height, and therefore arguably, I disagree with this, arguably more affordable housing because you can build taller. These are countervailing pressures to allow much more density and a much greater height, and basically to work against having low-density residential. So we're trying to maneuver. Peter?
Okay. The argument that's being made for complete flexibility in zoning, your argument, seems to work toward allowing developers to do what you're calling squishy interpretation of the zoning. I'm not real clear on where you stand about this. Squishiness obviously is a term by its character that sounds negative, and to me it's very negative. You have sounded as though it's negative, but if you're making arguments that can be used to justify it, then where are you? That is not the question I mainly came up with here.
Okay, but I will repeat what I said a minute ago. We're trying to find the balance between the plan being specific and it being general. The plan is not as specific as the zone map. It's not allowed to be, and I don't believe it should be. And going back to my time with you in the trenches, we didn't argue that it should be as specific as the zone map. So it's trying to find that balance between being prescriptive enough as a plan. We want low as opposed to moderate or medium, but at the same time being general to allow then for the zoning commission, or in the case of PUDs, to within those designations.
If we go back to the way things were 30 years ago, I'm not sure we were as clear in our understanding as we are now, that the zoning commission will do whatever it, that is to say the mayor, believes it can get away with.
I completely disagree with you. I completely disagree with you. When you and I were active with ANC 3C, there was one PUD in the history of home rule that had been denied.
Okay.
Zoning Commission did whatever, and there was no independent office of zoning. There was the Matisse map for the. There was the Matisse map for the land use maps.
Okay, I don't think I want to get into that argument because I may be on the wrong side of it. Things were pretty bad, but they're pretty bad now, and the argument is whether they're worse now or not so worse.
But part of where they're bad now is that there's tremendous pressure for more housing and affordable housing, to the point where there is a lot of advocacy for basically getting rid of any restrictions that limit the amount of housing that can be built. We need affordable housing west of the park, and that there should be as much affordable housing or as much opportunity for affordable housing as there is elsewhere in the city. But so then we're talking about, and there were proposals, as I said before, to eliminate single-family detached zoning and to require that there be greater density on all residential lots. That we should go the way of Minneapolis or Oregon.
That would be pretty
Can we
bad.
just build affordable housing? In a rich city.
There are
Yeah,
available
let me
now.
get to the question I came up here with, which is about the definition of affordable housing. I think that term is being used distortedly to produce results that most of us, maybe all of us here, would agree are bad for low-income residents and therefore bad for the city in general. We are dragged down with our definition of affordable housing, as you very well know, by the weighting in the terms of suburban incomes. And if we get away from that definition, which leads to the result that what developers are told will count as distorted as affordable housing, in fact, often is not affordable. And we need to change that, if by no other means, by brute force defining affordable within the city, and not being tied down to a definition from suburbs. Now, I realize there are some federal requirements that may limit what we can do about this, but there must be some way in which we can avoid okaying quote, affordable housing that is not affordable. In my community, there is some support for the idea of getting rid of that term and talking about simply low-income housing, which is what the city is desperately in need of more of, and not getting it. Where can we go with this? We are stuck in a rut. We're getting bad results.
Well, the framework chapter doesn't define affordable. I don't recall, because I haven't really looked at it, whether the housing element does. The law does define affordable, and we do it as a percentage of area median income. And there has been an argument, in fact, I think we may have changed the terminology, but there's been an argument that area median income is too high. It's still defined as a percentage, and so we can always adjust those percentages. And as I recall, we have 3 categories, which are 30% or below AMI, 50 or 60% and below, and 80% and below AMI. Those actually do translate. It varies by size of family, and it translates to specific incomes, which you can look at on a table. If the percentages are too high, those can always be adjusted. I mean, I've heard this concern before, and I think really where there's a problem is that the Housing Production Trust Fund, which was supposed to target 40% of its expenditures for very low income, that's 30% and below, which, if I remember correctly, translates to a household income of maybe $25,000 and below. The Housing Production Trust Fund,
realistic for important parts
the
of
Housing
district.
Production Trust Fund has been, instead of spending 40%, has been spending maybe 20 to 30%. I think actually the percentage has gotten up in recent years.
Let's go to the next question.
Good afternoon. Question is more, I guess, comment and question from Columbia Heights. And so my issue really is not so much whether developers follow the comprehensive plan, but rather the city and its agencies respect the comprehensive plan. Going to land value recapture, for instance. Most of the time when subsidies do go into a project, there is also a PUD that accompanies those projects. And of course, as you're aware, DenTed or some other agency negotiates what actually happens. So with the framework element, if we talk about land value recapture, which is really designed to inform the more detail later. So the question is always, how do we write that into the framework so that it's followed when it gets down to the other chapters? I mean, that's really what we're trying to do. Similarly, with language that I think is racially biased, a lot of the dialogue in the framework, I think, is racially biased or just plain incorrect in describing, for instance, the forces that impact. I mean, to have a whole section describe the impact of forces but never mention a housing bubble that really drove the prices up, that had nothing to do with really direct demand as much as it did for speculation in the market, and then have a whole recession that almost collapsed the world economy, and those two things not even being mentioned in the framework in any concrete way. Whereas I can tell you in Columbia Heights, those things drove the cost of housing and some of the distortions in development that we're fighting. And so for those things not to be mentioned, I think is problematic in setting a perspective. It's not just, white people moved into certain neighborhoods or high-income people want to move into certain neighborhoods that's driving everything. The war, you name it, is city subsidy that has a lot to do with it. So I guess my question is, how do we structure a comprehensive plan that our own agencies feel they need to follow?
I'll be honest with you, and I don't know that I have the answer. As I think I indicated before, the comprehensive plan, while it speaks to many different policies, generally tends to be attended to by the zoning commission. And that's where, and it's because the charter says the zoning shall not be inconsistent with the comprehensive plan. I don't know that I have a better answer than that. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, my concern is that in the framework language, it speaks to the reason why many black folks have left the city. And it specifically says that they left by choice. And I think that most of us, particularly black folks, understand that it's not by choice. that a lot of people have left the city is by the economic conditions that have driven them out of the city. And so I would ask what can be done to really have a more correct look at the data that shows that, in this most gentrified city in the United States, that a lot of the forces that have come in, that it should be accurate in terms of the history of what's happening. Because otherwise we'll rewrite history, and I'm thinking about how, and many of us know that that many folks were driven out of Southwest through eminent domain. Eminent domain has been used in a lot of ways, and so we've been pushed out as opposed to leaving by choice a lot of times. And finally, what can be done to add in the fact that when developers come into sections where they buy up homes of black folks who by choice are leaving, that it's not equitable. And I think we're talking about equity here. The same home in Northeast Washington that's sold to a developer is going to be sold at a price much lower because of the area it is. But then when it's flipped, it's going to be just as high as Georgetown and anywhere else. So I just think the language in the framework has to really look at the history well, and it does us a disservice when it says that we're leaving by choice, because that's not true.
I would ask that you reread the committee print, because we changed a lot of that offending language in the bill as introduced. Yes, Andrew.
Hi.
Yeah.
And hold on just a second. Please look at the committee print, because I think we did change it, but if there's something that we missed, bring that to my attention. Yes, Andrew.
You made reference to parts of, well, some people, some elements of the community being disturbed by the fact that appeals were holding up projects. And I wanted to say that from my point of view, I thought that the court decisions that remanded a number of zoning commission approvals should have chastised both the zoning commission and the developers that they needed to adhere more closely to the comprehensive plan.
I would agree.
And that position was held by many of the people who testified last March. Yet, at the press conference you held last Monday, you acknowledged that under the new framework, or rather the amended framework, that it would be more difficult for appellants challenging zoning commission decisions to be successful in court. And that was very disappointing to me and even felt like a betrayal.
Well, again, why don't you read the language in the committee print? So there were some issues that have come up in the court cases, such as whether the zoning commission was correct in putting more density in one portion of a site and then offsetting that with less density in another part of the site. The existing language was unclear about that, so the language is clearer. And I'm trying to think, there was some other language speaking that we added. It was not what the Office of Planning wanted with regard to PUDs, which was basically whatever the Zoning Commission determines is the correct interpretation. We didn't do that, but we put some language in that did make it clearer that the Zoning Commission needs to pay attention to, for instance, displacement as a result of the development. Being clear about that as opposed to being vague about that. And I think that those instances and others will make it more difficult for some of the cases, the Monroe Street one, even McMillan, Berry Farms. The overriding theme from the court was that the Zoning Commission did a horrible job writing an order, explaining what it was doing. I have to again emphasize that there are competing forces, dynamics at work with regard to the comprehensive plan and what the council is doing. The mayor sent down a bill in response to the litigation regarding PUDs that would make it very difficult for citizens to appeal. We didn't go that far, but she is reflecting a pressure, a very real pressure that has real traction because the storyline that the developers are saying has been picked up by affordable housing advocates, namely that there are thousands thousands, 5,000, 10,000 affordable units that are not getting built because all the people who are appealing these PUDs. So it may be false, but the result of that is that there is pressure to make the plan dumber.
Can't you call a lie a lie?
I need-
It may be false.
I need
it
13
is false.
Robin, I need
And you
13
guys know
votes.
that. And you need to stand up for us. And everyone in this room thinks that. And everyone in this room was at that hearing.
Robin, I need 7 votes at a minimum.
Well,
And
get
I-
rid of Jack Evans. I don't have representation.
Jack is not the problem on this.
Oh, yes, he is. He's not. I shouldn't have brought it
One
up.
of many.
You said we need the vote.
Well, I do need the votes, and the fact of the matter is that there's a lot of pressure right now from affordable housing advocates, Greater Washington, Coalition for Smarter Growth.
There's a line of people asking questions.
They're not listening to protest.
All right, I'll just ignore them, but unfortunately, some of my colleagues will not.
But don't say they're
They're not
housing.
voting for you.
Yeah, because they're not development.
They've helped define affordable housing at $1,500 a month for a studio.
You can characterize them, Chris, you can characterize them any way you want to, and they can characterize themselves any way they want to, but I can tell you that the argument that was circulating for 2 weeks before the council was that there needed to be some changes. The most out there one was, as I've said, the getting rid of single-family detached zoning in order to promote more housing. And that's a line that has carried weight in this council on other issues. I'm just telling you, that's a very real dynamic. And you can dismiss it, and you can say they're unreasonable, and you can say, well, I should just stand up to them. But I can tell you that there are members who are very susceptible to the argument that we need to get rid of the Hyde Act, we need to get rid of single-family detached zoning, we need to allow developers to be able to pretty much develop whatever they want to because we have an affordable housing crisis. And you saw that reflected in the bill that the mayor sent down, and I've seen that reflected in some of the other legislative proposals and discussion on different issues before the council. It's very real.
But do you actually believe that?
No, you don't have a microphone. Oh, now don't push her out of the way.
You say, Chris, but do you actually believe the affordable housing crisis is because of a lack of housing or because of all this luxury housing that's gone up? I mean, the amount of luxury housing that's being built, you figure we would have solved the housing crisis. It's only gotten worse. So it's not helping. Build more is not helping. And it's just not working.
I wanted to address 3 issues very quickly. First, you referenced the cases, the zoning cases, Monroe, McMillan, and Barry Farms. One of the major things that the DC Court of Appeals said is that because of PUD, you have to look at the impacts, and the Zoning Commission failed to do that. The Zoning Commission did not look at impact of displacement, did not look at impact on the environment, did not look at impact on public services. That's for McMillan. The Zoning Commission did not look at the adverse impact of moving 100,000 public housing residents off the site and giving them less green space than they already had. So it wasn't just giving reasoning, they ignored the whole issue of impact assessment of displacing neighborhood people. And I read those cases many times, and even though I'm not a land use lawyer, I'm a labor lawyer, that came through loud and clear. Secondly, just to piggyback on the minister who spoke about being accurate with regard to gentrification, it's not just the building luxury housing. I agree with her. It's black people and poor people have been pushed out. The U.S. Department of Justice had two settlement agreements with Capital One for redlining against black and Latino people who have the same assets, income, and credit rating as white people. And one settlement, this is since 2007, one settlement against SunTrust Bank for the very same thing, discriminating against black and Latino people. So it's not just in rental and affordable housing. People who can afford to buy are not being allowed to buy. And so that should be reflected, because we have a history of redlining in the District of Columbia, and that should be given as a factor of why there are fewer black people in the city. I know you've changed. I looked at the print, and I see you took out the woefully offensive language that Director Shaw had in there, but it's still not factually accurate. What I wanted to speak about, and the reason why, as chair of ANC 4D, we did a resolution about land value recapture, is that we've had 3 meetings since December where we've had an uproar at our ANC meetings, because developers have come and wanting variances to build higher when they have, as a matter of right, to build 2 separate units, and they want to build 3. And then they'll say, oh, it's going to be affordable because each of those 3 units will be $600,000. That brings me to, it was just really an uproar in ANC 4D. The point of land value recapture is when the city upzones for a developer. They're making the land more expensive. They're making it so that the developer can get more profit, more potential profit from whether it's commercial uses and or high-end residential uses. And that's what happened with most of the Hope 6 grants, particularly Arthur Capper with the Navy Yard. Now someone, even with my income, probably can't even afford to live there. So what land value recapture is saying, the government has given the developer a bonus by upzoning, making them able to get more potential profit. And therefore, for that reason, apart from inclusionary zoning, this is not inclusionary zoning, apart from that, there should be some return as a quid pro quo by the developer for affordable housing, because the upzoning is making everything more expensive and pushing more people out. And that should be a guiding principle. New Jersey has done it, Washington State has done it, and over the summer I'm going to do research on that and send that to you, but it's something that really should be a guiding principle, because the city has given the benefit to a developer by giving more, by upzoning. It happens in Noma as well. There are examples all over this city, and so it should be really a guiding principle.
Well, as I said before, my bias is where you are, so if you have some legal research, but we'll look at it as well. And you mentioned New Jersey and Washington?
New Jersey and Washington State.
Washington State. We'll look at those.
New Jersey very explicitly.
We'll look at those. And if you think that there's, this goes for everybody, if you think there's still some inaccuracies in the earlier parts of the framework where it discusses the forces for change, send us some comments. Now, if it's just your opinion, we need to say more about this as opposed to that. That may be a little harder to do, but if there's an inaccuracy, we definitely don't want that. So send us that. Yes, sir.
Yeah, how you doing today, Mr.
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm okay. So, yeah, Mr. Mendelson, so you came to one of our listening sessions that we did, town hall meeting we did in the last past election, and you stated that you believe that people should have a human right to housing in this city. And me, as a lifelong DC resident and a person of color, you know, and just looking at this room, you know what I'm saying, when it comes to racial equity, I don't really need white people to be nice to me. I have a whole lot of friends that's nice to me right here, you know, so I need, you know what I'm saying, and people my age that's been living in this city, we need to be able to live here with some dignity and have universal right to housing in this city. And you said you believe that housing is a human right, but you want to know which of your council members believe that also. And you know, you guys have been economically discriminating against black folks in this city for a lot of years now, and you're now talking about racial equity. That racial equity needs to start with those 14 properties that you call public housing. You can call it community housing. You can call it whatever you want to call it. But if you want to take that housing and that property and you want to make it 3 tiers of housing for 30%, 60 to 30, 80 to 60, you need to do that across the city. That's what the comprehensive plan called for, to make housing, 1/3 of the housing in the city affordable. And it should be universally affordable to residents of the city. They should be able to live anywhere up on Connecticut. If you got you got a building on Connecticut Avenue with 100 units, you want to build a building on Connecticut Avenue that's 12 stories high, make the first 4 floors universally affordable. It's not rocket science to make things fair in the city, to make things equitable in the city. It's just for people to stop discriminating against folks economically. And you guys have been doing it for years, and you need to be held accountable. For public housing, $2.2 billion in disrepair? If a CEO was running a company and they lost $2.2 billion, what would happen to that CEO? He would be fired. We need to be recalling the mayor. And you can't put it on, y'all guys can't put it on the federal government.
Why not?
Yeah, that's y'all excuse. This is y'all city. Y'all are the great politicians here. Y'all are our representatives. This is y'all city, man. You can't put it on the federal government. Somebody needs to be held responsible, accountable. So my question to you, Mr. Mendelson, when are you going to make housing in the city universally affordable? You are the leader on that council.
We're working on it.
Well, rare form today.
I could talk at great length about affordable housing if you want me to. So the gentleman talks about public housing. Public housing is a federal program. It's federally funded. The federal government has been slowly over the decades disinvesting from public housing. It's a serious problem. It's a significant component of affordable housing in this city. The city, our local funds have been increasingly used to fill the gap where the federal government has backed out. But that doesn't change the fact that I think it's completely proper for me and any local official in any city in this country to say that the federal government has a responsibility to put more dollars in, not fewer dollars, into public housing.
Oh, we agree with that, but the
Okay.
city double-crossed the
So
public
the
housing
city
residents
has
with
added,
private
Renee,
taxes.
let me, so the city has put in, not a few million, as I recall, we're now putting in about $150 million a year. Now, don't hold me to that figure, because it might be more, it might be a little bit less. But we're putting in a significant amount of money into public housing. Into public housing, that's not our housing, that's federal housing. That's housing that has to abide by federal laws, such as if somebody has a felony conviction, they can't live in the housing. A mother who's there and her son commits a felony, she has to move out or she has to kick her kid out. Those aren't our laws, those are federal laws, that's federal housing, and we are paying an increasing amount of money for federal housing.
What did you say about the
And any of you who are paying attention to this budget know that I
waged
waged a fight against our chief financial officer to get $25 million more in or $24 million more in for repairs, because the federal government isn't doing the maintenance. So that's just a piece of the affordable housing. We are putting in, if you include homelessness, we are putting in over $500 million a year into affordable housing. At least $150 million a year for homelessness. For next year, we have $116 million going into the Housing Production Trust Fund. That's more than 3 times any other city, more than any other city per capita. I'm wrong when I say 3 times more than any other city. I think there's one other city that does more in actual dollars, but it has more population. We are putting a lot in for affordable housing.
But Mr.
We have put in this budget, we took what the mayor proposed, and the mayor has made a priority of affordable housing over anything else, including public education. And if you want to change the income gap, you're going to have to improve public education. Because education directly correlates to people's ability to get a job, and it directly correlates to how much they can earn. And when we have 30% of our kids dropping out and another 30% who aren't really worth the high school diploma, we need to put a lot more money into public education. But the mayor's putting more money into affordable housing. Good. We're putting more money into affordable housing than we ever have before. Is it enough to solve the problem? No. The problem is huge. The problem is huge in part because our city is still growing at about 1,000 people a month. You get more people in, you have more demand for housing. We're trying a number of different strategies. I'm only saying this because somebody snickered when I said we're working on it because you didn't think that was enough of an answer. So I'm trying to give you more of an answer now. I'm not saying we got it perfect, and in fact, if you read any of the DC auditors' reports, you'll know that we are wasting millions of dollars in the Housing Production Trust Fund. Wasting. Okay, and that's on the executive, not on the council. Maybe we could do better oversight. But it's not for lack of our putting money in, and it's not for lack of our looking for different strategies to try to do more with regard to housing. So we're doing it, and that's why I said we're working on it.
Get him.
Yes, Laura.
I'll be brief. Thank you for coming and sharing your thoughts and expertise. There are a couple of things. I wanted to emphasize the other zones may apply language is as treacherous as Nancy described it as being. But that will be used by the Zoning Commission, the Office of Planning, to jump 2 or 3 levels of density, because we've all seen it done. So the other zones may apply language.
But and I'm happy to sit down with you, Laura, and discuss it, but this is the problem. When we have, and I'm sorry, I'm still a little worked up. When we want to say that the difference between low density and moderate density and medium density is, and one way to do that is to say, well, look at these zone categories because they kind of illustrate. But maybe we don't have the zone districts exactly. And actually, some of the zone districts maybe apply to 2 categories. So if we don't mention the zone districts, we don't have that problem, but then we have less of a description.
We can talk about it, but that language is insidious in practice. I hear the intent, but it's insidious in practice. And the description of some areas as being our plans medium to moderate. It should need to be one or the other. Okay. That's because if it's medium to moderate, then it just bumps up to the highest level.
Okay, but I think that's in the land use element, not in the framework.
I just make sure because you might be able to because it's going to affect how the plum is put together. Also, we need the word definition, strategy, description is very important because it has greater weight. Anyone can ever actually manage to get a case into court.
You said definition as opposed to description.
Description,
Okay,
yeah.
but I believe we used the word definition and the Office of Planning objective.
I would like to suggest on the issue of affordability, there were lots of proposals, among council members at the hearing on rebuild first, rehouse first, and of course the issue of what's really affordable is a problem. I think if we included in the language something about the affordability, the people who are affected by development, there must be affordable housing built that's affordable by the zip code in which it's being built. If you're going to build in Ward 8 or Ward 7 where I live, and you want to come in and say, well, we're going to build affordable housing, and you're talking about across the city affordable. No, it's affordable to the people in the zip code that are affected by the development. And that's going to cure a lot of your problem right there. And it's not going to run afoul of putting in language that maybe should belong more properly in the housing element. But I think that there's a lot that can be done to strike the balance you're seeking. But right now, the framework is still tilted way, way in favor of the developer community.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chairman Mendelson. Thank you for improving the framework, and thank you very much for being willing to work with your colleagues on things like land value recapture and some of the things that Brianne Nadeau wants to work on. I don't think we're quite there with the framework, but I appreciate your accepting that it's a work in progress. I also want to thank you for saying that you will work with Empower DC on public housing. I think we have a chance to have public housing, have a good public housing in this city, but it's going to take leadership on the part of the council, and I'm just so grateful that you are willing to do that. Thank you.
Thanks, Eleanor.
Chairman Mendelson, I'd like to add to some of the things that people's already said. I actually haven't seen the committee print, which was, as far as I know, was dropped on Monday and then was voted on Tuesday, which is kind of troublesome to a lot of us. On the other hand, I saw your print that came out previous Tuesday. And, oh, sorry about that. I saw your print that came out the previous Tuesday, and it really does make a lot of improvements in terms of talking candidly about the roots of displacement of low-income people and black people as not being just a matter of people voluntarily leaving for the suburbs, but being driven out by higher housing costs. I thought that was really an improvement, and whoever your staffer was who did that, I think it's great. There are a couple of things. I guess I have a big question, and I have a small question. You mentioned the small question. I'll get out of the way. At least in your print, not the committee print, which I haven't seen, and I don't know how to get hold of it. But in your print, towards the end, there's language in there saying that the comp plan is not designed to freeze development through 2025. And it was sort of like, wait a minute, this looks like this could get modified again. The zoning, the development guidelines could get modified again between now and 2025. That seemed troublesome to me. The bigger question that I guess I want to ask you, you've said that the rewrite of the comp plan and the whole question of development, it's a matter of different forces at work. There are a bunch of different forces at work, and there are people who, in the name of affordable housing, are saying we have to weaken the comp plan, or we have to make it harder for people to challenge, the zoning commission decisions. There's a crude old song from the 30s written by a communist, I believe, which is, "Which side are you on?" And I have a feeling that you're mostly on the side of people who don't want to simply give away the store to the developers. And you've got political challenges. I guess the thing is, if there are contradictory forces at work, we represent some of those forces, and we would like to prevail over the other forces.
Of course.
And the question is, how do we do it? Right now, it looks as though the developers are getting over in the name of affordable housing, and what's really important to them, I think, is having a good place to invest extra money they've got on hand for profits. Or if you're a contractor, this is a great way to get a new contract to build something. Frankly, if you're a construction worker, this is a great way to get a job changing the city. But it has to work in a way that genuinely promotes affordable housing. And I wonder what you're doing and what we can do to make sure that it really promotes affordable housing and it isn't just a way to park capital investment. If that makes any sense.
Let me cover three things real quickly. First of all, you made a couple references to the document that you were able to look at. I kind of touched on this earlier, but just so everybody understands. Typically what happens with the legislative process is that a bill's introduced, that when the committee marks up, and the committee of the whole in this case, that there's a committee print. The committee print is circulated the day before the markup and then is voted on. I took the unusual step of circulating a draft a week before. There were some changes between the draft and the final committee print, which was circulated the day before, and there were some changes then on the day of the vote. Not a lot of changes, and I wouldn't say that they were significant. Of course, it depends. So, you can go to my website, I believe, to get the staff draft, but at this point that's kind of irrelevant. You can go, I believe, to my website to get the committee print that was circulated. That's an important document, and I believe you might be able to get that as well through the council's, the secretary's, the council's website. The amendment sheet, I think, will be online or is online. There were a couple of amendments. There was one by Councilmember Nadeau, and there was an amendment sheet that I had. So what's important right now is the committee print that was circulated, the draft committee print that was circulated on Monday. It should be available through the council's website, and the amendment sheets, which I believe the secretary posts pretty quickly after the meeting. You would look at the bill number to find that. You won't find the committee print when you pull up the bill, because we haven't filed the committee print. We have to file the report and file the print.
You just go to your website.
So you go to my website, which you can get to through the council's website, to get what I circulated on Monday, because everything that was circulated, that would be the report, would include the print. And then the amendment sheets, I believe, will be on the council's website under the bill itself. It's Bill 23-1. That's with regard to the documents. The reference to 2025 was actually in the plan as adopted in 2005, and we just left that language in there. When you look at the committee print, you won't see any red line between, actually you will, in the committee print, the committee report, but I don't think that this is online. We have a comparative print. So you won't, in the committee print itself, you will not see a red line showing the changes from the current framework. That 2025 reference is in the current framework. And then, let me toss this out. If you want to get a sense of what the arguments are that you're up against, I would suggest you go to Greater Washington, the website, and look up, they have articles, and I don't know what else they have, which will explain what they're proposing and what their arguments are. I don't know for a fact, but I think the Coalition for Smarter Growth may have on their website something that explains. What I'm told is that with regard to Councilmember Nadeau's proposal to get rid of the single-family zoning, that there's a coalition behind that, which includes Greater Washington, Coalition for Smarter Growth, several, I'm going to say nonprofit housing developers, not the big ones that we know, and I think if you poke around, you'll get a sense of who some of the players are and what the arguments that they are making.
Phil.
Yes.
McGuire. I think we are deeply familiar with Greater Washington and the Coalition for Smarter Growth. We are very familiar with their developer funders. We are very familiar with their positions. And I think we also speculate fairly accurately about their intentions. So, you know, we've been there. My point.
But that doesn't minimize it.
I'm not
It's
minimizing it.
I didn't say you were, but I'm saying to everybody here.
I'm not minimizing it at all. We are well aware of how appealing the ideological, sort of idea of the moment, which is certainly what eliminating single-family housing in the city, which obviously is aimed towards Ward 3, but all over the city people value their single-family residences. All over the city. This is not just a rich white Ward 3. Anyway, my point here is different. I wanted to underscore the issue of impact analysis that Renee discussed, because that is a very fundamental principle that needs to be well articulated in the framework. The impact analyses that the Zoning Commission relies on are often really almost non-existent. If you looked at the transportation element of the McMillan plan, It was a farce. If you looked at what Harriet Tregoning did on the billboards at Verizon Center and Gallery Place, it was nothing. It was really a dismissal that there was an impact. So I think the council needs to follow up an oversight with OP to make sure that that link is really strong between good planning and what the zoning commission has in front of it to act on in terms of impacts.
Okay. Thank you.
And I wanted to say one thing too, where you were talking about your statement about we're working on it, and I said, what kind of an answer is that? That was 4 words, response to somebody, and I think your subsequent description was really more what would have been appropriate. So it wasn't saying that you weren't working on it. It was saying that the response that you gave of 4 words to a long room was not the kind of response to get. It wasn't. It could have gone into more detail.
Thank you. Yes,
Woman White, Ward 8. This young man said something about the units on 8th and H and 8th and Benning, studio apartments. But what I am hearing is $1,700 for per se closet. And looking at the structure, it's not going to be socially accessible, and it certainly won't be accessible for children. Berry Farms. We all know that it was slavery owned, and a few of those units that are still standing, I'm pretty sure the mortgages has been paid, but they're still being phased out. I'm pretty sure they have already kept up with their property taxes, but I'm sure they are still being phased out. Ward 8 mostly is senior citizen that I am a part of. It's a struggle. There's nothing accessible to the bus units, grocery stores, whatever. But I'm pretty sure the units on Ward, down there on Benning Road, $1,700 a month, that's not including utilities, water, gas, electric, or whatever else you want to have. Nothing is easy for anybody. It's not just a black thing, it's a human thing. And we all need to get together and format ourselves behind you all and your team. Now, it's just a suggestion. Your team should get out and just canvass the area and see what's going on from behind your desk. Another thought and final thought. Benning Road, Texas and B. Benning and B. There is a structure there next to a church that should not have been allowed to be built. Go by and see. And I don't understand how these people are coming in with deep pockets. You're going under the table because you're not going over the table. You're going under the table and money talks. And somebody's turning a blind eye to all of it. It needs to be stopped.
Is that a new development? The Benning and B, is that new?
Benning and B, Texas and B, behind Plum Elementary School.
It's new?
From what I understand, that it was supposed to be, the council, whoever the ANC commission is, went in for the community and they stayed on it. But yet still the structure still went up. So what I'm told and what I'm hearing, that inspector came in and shut it all down, but the structure is still there. So eventually it will be finished.
What is it?
It's a house. It's a house. I understand that instead of it going zoned out, it's zoned up, and it's zoned up too high. So.
Thank you. Ruby Steigerwald, Ward 5, and this is sort of piggybacking on that gentlewoman's suggestion of your team going out and canvassing. So there was a hearing, a public hearing last March on the framework element, and the framework element has been rewritten, but now there's no public hearing scheduled between now and the
meeting, the council meeting on which it will be voted. And I really think that we need to have a public hearing. When I send emails to council members, I don't hear back. I don't know whether they read my emails. If we have a public hearing and people show up, at least I see that they're there. I just think that we need to have another public hearing so we can have a chance to read the new version and express not just to you, but to the whole council what we think about the new version before it's voted on.
I hear you. I'm not going to say there will be another hearing between first reading and second reading. There will be. I think that where the real work will be on the elements, the other elements, and I laid out earlier the process for that. And there will be at least one hearing on those elements.
On each element?
I didn't say there'll be a separate hearing on each element, but I am saying there will not be a 13-hour one hearing on the whole thing. And I've explained how the committee print, where we are, the first reading will soon be online. You can look at the print now, but what was actually adopted, which will be called, I didn't mention this earlier, the engrossed version, that should be online by the end of the month, so that folks can look at that and they can comment.
So we can look at it and comment, but why can't there be another public hearing?
We're far enough along in the process, and there's been so much input and comments that I don't see what a hearing would provide. And in addition, that would delay the final vote. Ordinarily, I guess let me say a little bit more. Ordinarily, the way legislation moves is that there's a committee print, there's a first vote, 2 weeks later there's the final vote. Here it is, I put out a staff draft a week before the print. We had the first vote, but there will be 2 months before the final vote. I think we're pretty clear on where the issues are. And I've said that there's a lot that's come up that is appropriate for the detail that goes into the other elements, the housing element, the land use element.
Chairman, but you would admit this isn't ordinary legislation. This is a 50-page, as you admitted, prose-like document that, most legislation isn't 50 pages long. It might be a few pages long.
You mean like the Budget Support Act, which was 150 pages long?
But it took about 4 months of, having hearings for every agency and then a major hearing within like a 5-month period. The last time the public had any news from your office or from the council at all about the comp plan and our 13-hour hearing was 1 week before the vote. That's just not acceptable for something as important as our central planning document. It really isn't. I want to challenge you on why you haven't, and this was our expressed concern from the beginning, the language of the mays and the shoulds have not changed into the musts and the shalls, into directives. This is the discretion, the mays and the shoulds gives the discretion to the zoning commission to say, well, the council said maybe we should do this, but we're not going to do it because we've explained ourselves here why we're not going to do it, and therefore you don't have any rights at the court. You don't have any rights to address this. We want to move to the musts and the shalls and the directives. I don't understand why you aren't pushing for that.
To what extent does the plan go beyond being a plan and becomes either the zoning statute or just a statute in general? This is a guide. How clear a guide is it? It's much more of a guide than it used to be. I think it is a better guide than the current plan. But how much farther does it go? And it's no longer a guide, statute.
Let me give you an analogy. When you're walking through a forest and there's a guide that says stay on the path, but the person leading you through that forest continually takes you off the path and you kind of get lost in the forest. This is what the zoning commission is doing to the people. They're taking us off the path of displacement. They're leading us into this forest of displacement because they're allowed to do it. So the question back to you is, Why do you want to cede so much of the council power and planning to an unelected group of 5 people, who are, by the way, no women of color, nobody from east of the river? These are 5 unelected officials determining the future of the city. Why are you willing to cede that to them?
I actually think that we've taken away some of the flexibility over the years. Again, I go back, we're the only jurisdiction in the country where the council doesn't do zoning, but we do the comprehensive plan. How far does the comprehensive plan go? Some of you know that I've been involved with this issue since the early 1980s. I alluded to this earlier. The plan used to be just I called it a Matisse map, a blob map. It had no streets on it. Finally, there were streets on it, but it still was very imprecise. Now, the map isn't before us at this point. All we have is just the introductory chapter, but when you say change the shoulds to shalls, now what you're trying to do is you're trying to make the plan more of the zoning map. And I think, philosophically, I'm not there, but I also think that creates a different host of problems, which is if we can legally do it, I don't know that you want the council to actually be doing the zoning, because I've seen what the council does when it does try to be more specific. It responds to developers with regard to I want to upzone this property, so make this high density.
They're doing that right now through asking the maps to be changed and upzoned. They're doing that right now. In this planning process with the comp plan, there is a map called the future land use map that lets the zoning...
You're talking about what's before the Office of Planning right now? Because it's not before the council right now. What is before the council right now are some of the proposals I alluded to earlier, which does have developers behind it, which is the getting rid of single-family zoning and getting rid of the Hyde Act.
But if you want to talk about philosophy, I mean, we've been meeting for 2 years about this. The philosophy of the zoning commission is rubber stamp, rubber stamp, rubber stamp. Build, build, build. What the developers bring, we approve. 99.9% of the time. You did the math on that at one of the hearings. So if that's the philosophy, you're okay with their philosophy then? That's where we disagree. We're saying we want our elected officials, not by a project-by-project basis, because that's where the political stuff gets wrapped in, and that's why we see Jim Graham and Michael Brown and folks like this getting caught up in problems with fraud and greed. But what we're talking about is such a big plan, and these are general policies in the plan. We want those policies to be directives to the zoning commission. We want the zoning commission to ensure land value recapture when they upzone and allow a big box to be built. We want significant affordable housing, and they're truly affordable housing. Right now, that is up to the commission to do. And they are okay, by example, Union Market. 6,000 new residential homes approved by the zoning commission, rubber stamped over 20 projects. 6,000 new residential units. And the 40 acres that is Union Market. 10 affordable family-size units approved by the zoning commission. Is that the philosophy you want them to have the discretion over? Or do you want to have more power in that process to say, no, out of the 6,000, we need at least 2,000 units to be affordable for families, not 10. So that's a question to you. Do you really trust this zoning commission without your directives to do the right thing? And if you don't, then why aren't we making the shoulds into shalls and the mays into musts?
Well, again, the shoulds into shalls is a function of whether this is a plan or something more, and I can guarantee you that if it becomes more prescriptive, that there will be much more developer involvement before the council, more than there already is. But I was a little bit confused with regard to what you were bringing up with Union Market. If you want more density, we can map it, when we get to the land use element, we can map it for higher density. If you want less housing, we can map it for less housing. If the issue is affordability, if we're talking about affordability in a project that the city's directly involved with, such as a disposition, we're already doing 20, 30% and more that's affordable. Here we're talking about the private market, the private sector market, but we're saying in the framework element that has not been in there before is we want housing, and we want affordable housing. And you turn the page, we want housing and we want affordable housing. The framework prior to this iteration said virtually nothing about housing or affordable housing. So we're making it clear that in the private sector we want to see more affordable housing. With regard to the public sector, we're already doing a lot through statute, not the plan, to require more affordable housing. But I think some of what I'm hearing you say is more appropriate for the land use element, where we get to be more prescriptive through the map with specific areas in the city. I don't know that we're disagreeing hugely. I think we're disagreeing more by degrees.
Yeah, I think you're right, but because you actually acknowledged the land value recapture and the project impacts in your markup under land use change areas. So you took those concepts, but you refined them down to a certain specific area in the city called a land use change area. We want those concepts pulled out of a specific area of the city and be applied broadly throughout the city. So I'm hoping that that's what we can get to in the next couple months, sitting down with you, is to take some of the stuff that's already been acknowledged in the red line that Julia and yourself and the council voted on, and get that applied more broadly, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Okay.
Are you the last? You're not the last.
So I just actually wanted to ask about an aspect of our platform that hasn't really come up much today, which is the impact assessment component. Because you mentioned earlier that you really think that the Zoning Commission should have a role in essentially making sure that new development, doesn't have adverse impact on public health. Not quite clear on why that is at odds.
That's not exactly what I said. The premise behind zoning is that it is to protect the public health.
Yes.
And I'm saying that without having read the case law. And this, I'm talking about case law that goes back to the 1920s. The city governments have police powers, and one of the police powers is to regulate public health. I don't think it's so much safety. It's, zoning is premised on light and air, adequate light and air, and as well as controlling density. And that, I think, devolves to public health.
My name is Rebecca. And so in any case, I wasn't really going to get into this whole argument about whether or not that precludes land value recapture. My intent was really to focus in on that role of monitoring or looking at what a development is going to do to public health. Right now, under the comprehensive plan, assessments are supposed to happen, but we know that they haven't been. And if the Zoning Commission has this role related to public health, it seems like they would need to have information about how developments and changes are going to impact public health in the city. So given that the language in the comprehensive plan and calls to these assessments but hasn't actually led to them taking place, I just was wondering how you are going to make sure that this next draft of the comprehensive plan actually strengthens that language to make sure that these things actually happen the way that it looks like they're actually already supposed to be.
Well, let me see. With regard to the framework, I'm not going to stand here and say that there are going to be substantial changes in that regard. I think that would be more appropriate to the land use element and the other elements of the plan to get into more detail with regard to that. We did add in the framework, this would be reflected in the committee print, language with regard to displacement. I want to say that the framework said nothing about displacement until this version. I might be off by that, but I know that we gave some attention to displacement, and we also tried to strengthen language with regard to the Zoning Commission's obligation to look at adverse effects.
So are you committed to strengthening in general in the comprehensive plan the language around impact assessment to make sure that public health impacts are being assessed?
I don't know what that means, but I certainly will look at that. Hello, Robin.
Hello, Phil. I'm sorry if I yelled at you. And I'm sorry to everyone if I was rude. 3 things very quickly. My name is Robin Diener, Bill writes. We talked about education. As the adult literacy teacher in the room, the word plan does not mean guides.